Well, my friend Father J. Scott Newman is our guest this evening, as I said, and Father Newman is was a student at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome for 5 years, and he was ordained into the diaconate uh, in December of 1992 in St. Peter's Basilica. And Father Newman, that was by Pope St. John Paul II, was it not?
No, no. The ordination was conferred by James Cardinal Hickey, the Archbishop of Washington.
Okay, sorry, I was mistaken. But the next year, you were then ordained as a priest in our cathedral church here in Charleston, and that would have been, was that by Bishop Baker?
No, by his predecessor, David Thompson,
Right.
July of 93.
Father Newman holds degrees in sacred theology and canon law, and he's now not only the pastor of St. Mary's in Greenville, but the Piedmont area dean and a member of various committees on the diocese, helping Bishop Guglielmoni, and is very much a leader in the Diocese of Charleston. I should say that Father Newman also is, I think, can take the credit for the remarkable renewal of Catholic life in the upstate of South Carolina. When he arrived at St. Mary's in, was that the year 2000, Father Newman?
2001.
In 2001, he got busy renovating the beautiful neo-Gothic church in downtown Greenville, not just architecturally, but also renovating the liturgy and bringing it back into a Catholic expression of the faith. Not to say that they weren't Catholic before, of course, but the situation in the church, I think, had St. Mary's had suffered from a recovation in the building, but also the parish had suffered from poor leadership and some scandal over the years as well. Is that correct, Father?
Yes, one of my predecessors was an abuser of minors and was removed from office just before Christmas, December of 92.
So you had to pick up the pieces and rebuild, which you've done remarkably. And in the process, Father Newman has been a mentor to me and to Father Chris Smith, who's the pastor over at Prince of Peace, and helped a number of other young men towards the priesthood and the religious life. And St. Mary's has therefore become a real center for liturgical and ecclesial renewal in the upstate. So thank you, Father Newman, for your witness and your hard work. I'd like to just share, for the interest of our listeners, how we came to meet. Folks might remember that I had moved over to England. I'd been to Bob Jones University in the 1970s, went to England to study for the Anglican priesthood and was ordained over there. But my family had moved from Pennsylvania in the early 80s to Greenville, where they started a business and settled. So Greenville was my hometown in the States, although I was living, and by this time had married and had children, over in England. And we were home visiting my family in Greenville in 2001 when I read an article about this new pastor at St. Mary's. And by this time, we had been Catholics for about 4 or 5 years, but ordination had not happened in England, even though I had applied for lots of complicated reasons. And so I got in touch with Father Newman and reached out, and he sort of said, "Are you the Dwight Longenecker that's written some books?" And I said, I don't think there's anybody else with that name, so it must be me. And so he invited me around to talk, and I told him the sad tale of woe, in which I had been waiting in England to be ordained as a Catholic priest for about 4 or 5 years. And Father Newman encouraged me to apply to the Diocese of Charleston, saying it is possible to have 2 bishops, although my bishop in England was reluctant to ordain. He said, "You should meet Bishop Baker." And Father Newman said, "As it happens, he's coming here for dinner tomorrow night." Well, Bishop Baker, bless his heart, had come to Greenville, and at that time, Dr. Bob Jones at Bob Jones University had been going through a difficult patch with the media. They're blaming him for racism and so forth. And he was getting bricks from every side. And Bishop Baker went on to Bob Jones University campus, which of course is notorious for being anti-Catholic, and went to see Dr. Bob simply as the expression of a Christian brother saying, I'm praying for you. I know you're in a rough spot right now. And anyway, Bishop Baker was left to wait in the waiting room for about 45 minutes. And then someone came out and said, Dr. Bob doesn't want to talk to you. Obviously, a Catholic bishop turning up on campus was not a welcome sight. And so anyway, that evening, Bishop Baker comes down to dinner at the rectory with Father Newman, and I'm sitting there. And Bishop Baker listens to my story, and he scratches his head and says, excuse me, he said, you're a graduate of Bob Jones University? I said, yes, Father. He said, and you want to be a Catholic priest? I said, that's right. He said, you need to come to this diocese and be ordained. He says, you understand these people. I sure don't. So it happened that I was then invited back to the personnel board in Charleston and was approved to be a candidate for the priesthood in Charleston diocese. And it was going to be another 5 years before that actually happened and the right position opened up, but it finally did, so that in 2006 we moved back to Greenville, and it was my honor, of course, to be ordained as a Catholic priest in St. Mary's, Greenville, just a few miles from the front gate of Bob Jones University. So if you don't think the Lord has a sense of humor, there's a story for you. So thank you, Father Newman, for helping to encourage, push, and shove to get another priest to the diocese, and for encouraging me to be here and to take that step of faith. And it's been a happy relationship for now over 20 years here in Greenville.
That's right.
So, Father Newman, we're here this evening to discuss the title of our webinar, The Sacred Song of the Liturgy. And therefore, we have some questions about the interaction of liturgy with culture, because this is taking root in Catholic culture, part of an adult education program we have in the parish at Our Lady of the Rosary. And what I would like to start with is just to ask you, as a priest, as a fellow priest, how would you explain to a non-Catholic and perhaps to a non-Christian, what is the Mass? Where would you begin with a question like that?
It's Passover. Mass, the Holy Eucharist, is Christ, our Passover, who is sacrificed for us, that we may be delivered from sin and restored to the grace of God and become heirs with Christ to everlasting glory.
And how do you respond to someone who says, well, I'm not a Christian, I don't know what all that language means? What is the Mass? What happens there?
The privileged place for the transmission of the gospel is not a library or a lecture hall or a street corner. The privileged place for the transmission of the gospel is the worship of the church, which goes under the general name liturgy.
So the Mass then, and the celebration of the liturgy is, you would say, the library or the pulpit or the preaching place or where the place where the gospel is proclaimed.
And we'll come back to this in due course. The library, the classroom, the street corner, all of those are essential to the transmission of the gospel, to a deeper understanding of the truth of the gospel. But the privileged place where we encounter the crucified and risen Lord is in the church's prayer. Let me, if I may, just quote briefly from the document of the Second Vatican Council on the Sacred Liturgy. The liturgy, and this is from the Greek word liturgia, which in the ancient Greek world was the equivalent of our phrase public service. So if a politician who goes into office says that he's in public service, in Athens, liturgia meant someone who performs a service for the good of the city, usually at his own expense, not as an employee. And this concept of the work for people found its way into the New Testament. The word liturgia in one form or another appears 6 times in the New Testament, usually to describe the work of priests in the temple. So for example, in the Gospel of Luke chapter 123, we read that of Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, that when his time of service was ended, he went to his home. Time of service. The word service in the Greek is liturgia, or in the letter to the Hebrews describing the ministry of Christ himself at chapter 8, verse 6, Christ has obtained a ministry, a liturgia, which is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better. So this concept of public service, service for the people, comes from the ancient Greek understanding of public service into the church to mean the priestly service, first of the priest of the old covenant, like Zechariah, and then the high priest of the new and eternal covenant, Christ the Lord. So Vatican II says this: the liturgy is rightly seen as an exercise of the priestly office of Jesus Christ. It involves the presentation of man's sanctification under the guise of signs perceptible by the senses, that's the sacraments, and its accomplishment in ways appropriate to each of these signs. In full public worship, the liturgy is performed by the mystical body of Jesus Christ, that is, by the head and his members. It's Christ acting in the liturgy. And so the council says, from this it follows that every liturgical celebration, because it is an action of Christ the priest and of his body, the church, is a sacred action, surpassing all others. No other action of the church can equal its efficacy by the same title and to the same degree. This is why we should always use the adjective sacred to describe the liturgy. It's the sacred liturgy. It's an action of Christ the priest for the sanctification of the world.
So you use the word action, but you also, you use the word sacred, but you also use the word action. And earlier you referred to used the word transmission. So this is not simply a lecture. It's not simply an instruction or a catechesis. It's actually a corporate action through which the gospel is transmitted, or through which the gospel is transferred, if you like, and through which the gospel is encountered. So it's not just a performance that we go and watch. It's something that we go and, well, how would you comment then on the Vatican II saying that encouraging full participation in the liturgy? What does that mean?
Well, one of the goals of the Second Vatican Council in calling for a renewal of the liturgy was to re-emphasize to all the baptized that when they attend Mass, they are not spectators, they are participants. So when we go to the theater, whether the cinema or a live theater to see a play, the audience are spectators. We go and watch someone else do something. That is not what happens at Mass. The congregation may sit in a way analogous to the audience sitting in a theater, but the congregation is not involved like an audience at a performance of drama. The congregation are like actors on the stage. Everyone who is baptized and is present for the sacred liturgy is a participant in the liturgy. So one of the goals of the council was to help all the baptized understand that, so that they would grasp that they are coming to Mass not to watch someone else do something. They're not coming to watch Father say his Mass. They are coming to offer their entire lives as a sacrifice of praise. I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, Paul writes to the Romans.
So for me to participate fully, the fully is an encouragement for me to participate body, soul, mind, and spirit. In other words, participate the whole of me, to participate fully, yes. Not the idea that everybody who comes to Mass has to be given a job. You know, you and I have been in liturgies, I'm sure, where the priest feels that full participation means that you have to have the brownies and the Girl Scouts in the liturgical procession, and you have to have Mrs. Jones be one of the lectors and carry the Bible, and you have to have the deacon carry the gospel, and you have to have the Boy Scouts carrying some flags, and you have to have some flower girls sprinkling flowers, and everybody has to be given a job to do. That's not what full participation actually means.
No.
It means instead that we participate ourselves wholly and completely in this action.
So someone can sit in the pew and remain quiet for the entire Mass and still be participating fully, actively, and consciously by being present in mind and heart
and having prepared properly for the sacrament before
that's
they
right.
come.
And equally, it's possible for somebody to be very busy functioning in an external way and not be present spiritually and mentally at all.
Indeed. Or for those,
I've often seen, for
or for
example,
those who doze off during our homilies, Father.
that's right.
Yeah. Well, this therefore is very important because it means going to church, going to Mass, especially going to Catholic Mass, is a very different activity than going to the theater, going to the cinema, certainly than watching TV or going to a sports event and being a member of the audience. Instead, it's this full participation. How do you think the lack of liturgy in a predominantly Protestant country like the United States actually affects culture and affects the way we behave with one another in our world? Do you think it has any effect?
Oh, of course it does. It shapes our expectations of what's appropriate in public, of how we should behave in the presence of other people. If people come to Mass expecting to be entertained, they will always be disappointed. If they come expecting to have a deep emotional experience, they will almost always be disappointed. Right? No one goes to a courthouse expecting to be entertained or deeply moved, but the business that takes place in a courthouse is deadly serious, right? And yet, if people go to a football game in Death Valley and watch the Tigers play, or go to a concert of their favorite band, they want some kind of emotional high, and they want an experience that they can join by letting go of normal social constraints, so that they can shout and stamp their feet and raise their arms along with thousands of other people doing the same thing, right? And anyone who's ever experienced that kind of unity in action knows that it can be very stirring.
Takes you out of yourself.
It does. The
Yeah.
liturgy is not that, and it has to function in a different way. And yet it is still a common action of silence, of prayer, of presence before the presence of God, of unity in charity. And when people have joined others that way, particularly in singing the liturgy, it's a transforming experience, but it takes some time to understand how that works.
I think there are actually similarities in the fact that the liturgy, when we participate fully, should be able to take us out of ourselves, not in an artificial way, like you would have at a rock concert or a big sporting event or a big political rally, but taking us out of ourselves in the proper way within liturgy, in submitting ourselves to the Lord and opening up to something which is far greater than we are. In other words, we're stepping into the transcendent and therefore coming out of ourselves. I think there's also more connections between what happens in the theater and even in the cinema than perhaps we let on. My first degree was in speech and drama, and I've always been interested in the chemistry when I was studying script writing in what happens actually with the audience. And we discussed this last week when we were discussing film, saying that the point of the film or the drama is that the audience doesn't just sit there passively to watch. They're actually meant to have their heart engaged in what's happening with the hero, and to have our heart sympathetic with this cathartic transformation where we identify.
But the reason I started with that analogy is this: one of the deep flaws in the liturgical practice of Catholics in the years after the Council was the tendency of priests to step out of the role assigned to them in the liturgy and engage the people in conversation. Good morning, right? Instead of "the Lord be with you," "good morning and welcome to St. Dimphnis."
Yeah, I've been in one mass where the priest said, "Good morning, everybody. Did anybody see the White Sox game over the weekend?"
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's happening there is this: in a play where all the actors are inhabiting roles given to them by the playwright and speaking the words assigned in the text itself, they each know what the other is doing, and that enables them to work together to bring into being this experience of the play, right? But from time to time, for dramatic effect, for humor, for a number of reasons, one actor may, as they say, break the fourth wall. That is, turn to the audience, who is theoretically just a wall on the stage, and engage them directly in words that are not written by the playwright, right? Breaking the fourth wall is a sign that it's a wink and a nudge. We know that you're there watching this, and I'm going to acknowledge you now before I step back into my
But
assignment.
it breaks the whole play.
Right. When a priest does that to the congregation, right, what he's doing, whether he understands it or not, is treating the congregation like an audience at a play rather than like other actors on the stage, which is what they are. Everyone in the sacred liturgy has an assigned role and assigned words. And when we all stay on script, the experience transcends the contribution of any one person. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. If the priest arrogates to himself the privilege of breaking away from that and taking over the text by his own personal observations, then he's rendering active participants into passive spectators.
This is one of the reasons why I think we actually feel better when after we've been to church. Not because Father's homily was absolutely brilliant, although it may have been, not because the music was sublime, not because the architecture was magnificent, but because we've had this connection with the gospel. The gospel has been transmitted. We've participated in it. There's been a kind of purgation in that process, and we feel better when we come out of Mass. We say that our sins are forgiven and we've been cleansed, which is another way of putting the same thing. But I think this is part of the mechanics of it and how it works. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
One other topic which interests me is, having lived in England for 25 years, the English are still, because they have a monarch, a much more ceremonial people than we are as Americans. Every summer there's the trooping of the color, in which the monarch, and she used to come in on horseback. Now she rides in a car because she's over 90 years old. But she would ride in on horseback with all of her soldiers and the soldiers with the red scarlet tunics and the bearskin hats, and they would all come marching in formation down the Mall, the big boulevard in front of Buckingham Palace, for the trooping of the color, this military ceremony that goes on. And later in the year, the Queen turns up for the state opening of Parliament, and she wears the proper crown and she sits on a throne and she processes in, and there's processions and there's page boys and there's all the trappings of royalty. You see it whenever there's a royal wedding, and the last royal wedding, I suppose, was Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. But still, millions of people worldwide tuned in to watch this wonderful ceremony. And it struck me in watching part of it that this was not just a ceremony of royalty. This was a Christian liturgy. This was a Christian ceremony, complete with pomp and circumstances and pomp and circumstance and fine music and processions and all the rest of it. In America, we are far less ceremonial than that, although we do have our ceremonial moments. How do you think that the Catholic liturgy, properly celebrated, can bring back this element of ceremony? And is that ceremony just a lot of British fol-de-rol, or does it have a kind of function within culture?
I think there's a deep yearning in the human soul for mystery, for majesty, for splendor, to see the world charged with grandeur and beauty. And all of those things need to be experienced, not just verbally, not primarily verbally, but with symbol and ritual and all the signs that you just mentioned from the royal family. And where those things are not provided for people, they will provide them for themselves, right? I think that's why the royal family of Britain still sells newspapers and page clicks in the United States at such a vast pace. There's this yearning to see these things. Millions of people tuning in to the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh a couple of months ago, which in its spareness was still soul stirring.
Right.
So this yearning for majesty, for, if I can put it this way, for an enchanted world, a world that isn't just utilitarian, like a machine, a world that shimmers with beauty and the promise of glory just beyond the veil, just beyond our sight, that we can still sense. A blind man can still sense the sun in the sky. You don't have to have a sight to know where the sun is at midday, right? Even when we can't see the glory of God, we can sense it in this shimmering way through the veil.
And I think it is ceremony and ritual which actually opens our hearts and minds to that. Because here are people behaving in a way which is not typical. It's not just everyday behavior. I'm somewhat active on Twitter, and I put a tweet up earlier this week saying the season is coming in which people will start turning up to mass wearing shorts, tank tops, and flip-flops. And I said, how would they feel if me and Holy Deacon processed into the church wearing the same thing? And some people said, Father, you should just be thankful they're coming to mass at all. And I said, yeah, of course I am. But my point still stands. When we instruct our altar boys at OLR, and I'm sure you do this as well, I explain to them the reason that they stand in a particular way and the reason they give a little bow after I wash my hands and after Deacon gives them a book or whatever, is because we are behaving in a ceremonial way. And I tell them, you're not going to run around in church. You're going to put your cassock on and you're going to wear black shoes and you're going to walk in with a nice slow pace, because God's pace is slower than our pace. And the boys understand this immediately, and they nod and they're enthusiastic about it. And I say to them, through your body language, you're actually helping the people to worship, because this is part of their life.
Of course. When I moved back to the United States from Italy, after living in Italy for 5 years, one of the first things that I was conscious of landing at the airport was how badly Americans dress in public. And just the way you've described. Italians don't dress that way, even now. Short pants and flip-flops are for the beach, not for an airport, not for public spaces, not for being seen by others. There's still a sense of the dignity of clothing and of ways of behaving that are appropriate to one space and not another.
My English father-in-law observes how Americans have to always be eating something in public as well.
Sure, right. So in that environment, it's a little harder perhaps for people to experience liturgy, which by its nature is formal. That is, it adheres to a settled form, to an established form, and that is by its nature solemn. It's not something frivolous or throwaway. It has heft and dignity, and if you live your life without any of those things in any other setting, the contrast is sharp and can, for some people, be overwhelming. But if the liturgy is nothing more than an extension of the living room, right, or the ballpark, there's nothing distinctive about it. It has to be different for it to be authentic to itself.
And I believe people, if they actually come to Mass and see this more ceremonial and more formal and polite way of behavior and dignified way of behavior, they take it out into the world. It's infectious. Someone here, Father, has said, I'm getting the beauty and no silliness in the extraordinary form from every Sunday, as well as 3 other times at my church in Sugar Land, Texas. If that's St. Teresa's church, we actually know Kevin Clark, who's the organist there. And what would you have to say that you and I both do not celebrate the extraordinary form? We celebrate the Novus Ordo. But what would be your insights on the relationship between the extraordinary form, the Latin Mass, and the Novus Ordo, the Mass of Vatican II?
Well, first of all, let me say that as the sacred liturgy is celebrated in so many parishes, perhaps the vast majority of parishes in the United States, if I weren't a priest, I'm not sure I would have the strength to keep going to Mass. The liturgy in so many places is so bad. The ritual is sloppy. The music is horrible. The preaching is pointless. The behavior of people indicates everything except the sense of sacred. It's just dreadful. I understand why people who only have that available to them in the ordinary form in their parish
Just
want to shake the dust from their feet and find something serious, something real, something
either that or they go to a big Protestant megachurch where they do that sort of thing much better.
where they do it much better, and you can have coffee while you sit in your blue jeans, right?
Yeah.
So the powerful pull to the extraordinary form, I understand perfectly. My response to that is, you've never seen the ordinary form as the Second Vatican Council intended it to be, if that's all you've ever seen. So what we do at St. Mary's, what you do at Our Lady of the Rosary, what Father Smith is doing at Prince of Peace in the celebration of the ordinary form is what the Council intended. It's how John Paul II always celebrated the sacred liturgy. It's how Benedict XVI always celebrated the sacred liturgy.
And wasn't the reason Benedict XVI opened up and liberated the regulations on the Latin Mass was so that the extraordinary form, as he said, would inform the ordinary form, and there would be those celebrating the ordinary form would learn from
Mutual enrichment.
Mutual enrichment.
The ars celebrandi, the art of celebrating the liturgy, right, is something that priests ought to learn in the seminary. Before they enter the seminary, they ought to have learned it from their own experience of being children and young men in parish churches, probably serving at the altar. The problem is there was such a rupture, what Richard John Newhouse used to call the season of silliness, broke this living connection to liturgical form and art. And what was foisted upon us was tie-dyed vestments and St. Louis Jesuits with guitars and tambourines, which is not sacred and is not liturgical, but it was part of the revolution. Look at it this way. Look at photos of buildings constructed in 1930 and compare them to buildings constructed in 1968. Which would you rather live in, right? In 1968, there was a cultural revolution that reshaped public life in every discipline. In music, in art, in architecture, in design. The Catholic Church picked exactly the worst moment in 500 years to be translating the liturgy from Latin into the vernacular and modifying the ritual according to the principles established 100 years before at the foundation of the liturgical movement. It was just bad timing. So perhaps it was inevitable we go through this dislocation of all previous liturgical forms being cast off. A bonfire of the vanities, where vestments and liturgical books were often literally burned.
And relics and statues.
Yes. Churches ruined in the name of the council. Altar rails blasted out, confessionals destroyed, a spasm of iconoclasm.
That we did to ourselves.
Yes.
Nobody else did.
But my point is, not one of those things was caused by the Second Vatican Council. And when you read the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy and see the principles the Council enunciated to guide the liturgical reform, you begin to see why Benedict XVI spent so much time on the hermeneutic of continuity. We have to read the Council's documents and experience the life that they were intended to shape in perfect continuity with everything that came before. And anyone who says, no, this is somehow a fundamental break with the past, has misunderstood and misrepresented the Council itself.
I think one of the problems there also was that I contend that a lot of the things that were thrown out, say the old vestments, the old sacred vessels and so forth, I contend that a lot of the I'm a convert, so how can I say this? But I contend that a lot of the priests and people of that earlier time period, pre-Vatican II, they didn't actually know what those things meant. For them, it was just a load of dusty old statues and musty old churches that needed, to be updated. And I think a lot of the Catholics from the 1950s and early 1960s really had a sincere heart in which they said, we want our people to get it. We don't want them to be kneeling there mumbling through their rosaries through the liturgy and going to confession because they feel guilty over little venial sins they've done and be bound into this legalistic structure of not understanding their faith. We want them to be catechized. We want them to meet Jesus. We want them to really experience their faith. And they saw the revolution of the 1960s as the way to do that. Am I giving them too much benefit of the doubt?
No, I think you're exactly right. They were heirs to forms they didn't understand and did not find life-giving. And when the opportunity came to throw them off, they did. They threw them off. Think of it this way: if a man entered the seminary in 1962, right out of high school, and 8 years later in 1970 was ordained to the priesthood, when he entered as a freshman in college, he was given a cassock, a biretta, and a liber usualis. And when he was ordained to the priesthood, all of those things had been burned. And he was wearing a tie-dye t-shirt and strumming a guitar.
And skinny jeans.
Right. In
No,
8 years.
bell bottoms.
So from, let's say, from 1562 to 1962, there's very little change. And then between 62 and 70, there's a revolution. But what we have to remember is what was going on in the culture at the same time. 1968 is the symbolic year, of course, because of the political assassinations, Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the cities in flames, the student riots in Paris, the upheaval, the whole culture of the West was being rejected.
It was on fire.
That's right. And at that very moment, the Catholic Church was engaged in this process of retrieving ancient forms of theological expression, renewal of biblical studies, and the fruit of the liturgical reforms.
So with this phrase, the hermeneutic of continuity, you then would, I think we both agree that the answer is not to try to turn back the clock. The 1950s were not a golden age for the Catholic Church, even though numbers were great and, there were plenty of priests and so forth. There was also a lot of problems, which the fathers of the church really wanted to try to renew. But you would say that the way forward is always a way forward, not a way back.
Yeah, of course. And the way forward is the Lord Jesus Christ crucified and risen. All authentic reform is Christocentric and Christological. It's fidelity to Christ and to his gospel. There's a tendency in our effort to restore the lost forms to a kind of ecclesiocentrism that is not necessarily Christocentric. And that's always, I think, a temptation to be resisted. It has to be the person of Christ. We meet Christ in the liturgy, right? We meet Christ in the scriptures. We meet Christ in the sacraments. We meet Christ in the prayer of the church. All of those things are instruments for meeting the Lord. In heaven, there will be no sacraments because we will possess that which they signify. There will be no faith in heaven because the object of our love is united to us directly, right? There will be no need for hope because everything we hope for will be obtained. What will remain is Christ. And it's our union with him through these means, through these instruments that we're seeking.
Father, what about music at Mass? What about music in the liturgy? The documents of the Second Vatican Council recommend a predominant place for Latin and for the Gregorian chant. How do you weave that in to the Novus Ordo? Is it important to do so?
I think it's essential to do so. So at St. Mary's, at the Solemn Mass every Sunday, we sing the ordinary in Latin to a Gregorian mass of one kind or another. We also sing hymns in English from the tradition of hymnody, largely Anglican, Lutheran, and Methodist in inspiration from the 17th and 18th centuries. But texts that are more theologically Catholic than most of the drivel that was churned out in the 1970s on mimeograph paper.
Here, here.
The texts are deeply scriptural, either direct quotations from the scriptures or paraphrases of scriptural texts from the New Testament, from the Psalter, and they are orthodox in both senses, correct in doctrine and correct in worship. And the four square melodies of that time, that unusually productive combination of music and text, are easily learned. In fact, if you hear it once, you can probably sing it from memory. And they begin to form the mind and the soul in the way that only poetry can when it's set to music.
And I've been a bit annoyed to hear some Catholics sort of turn up their nose and say, "Oh, hymns, they're Protestant." Well, actually, the great hymns of the Anglo-Catholic movement are, as you say, deeply Catholic in their theology, and very often they're actually translations into English from hymns from the 3rd and 4th centuries, from the fathers of the church, from the Eastern Church, and are
many traditionalists
richly catechetical as well.
Yes, many traditionalists do wage a campaign against hymnody, even in the ordinary form of the Mass, because they were not sung at Mass in the extraordinary form. Hymns were sung at the divine office, and they were sung during devotions like benediction, but they were not part of the Mass itself, other than the Gloria, which is the hymn of the Mass. So the antiphons, which are part of the ordinary, were the texts that were sung. But the difference is that the singing of the antiphons requires time to learn, whether you're singing in Latin or the vernacular, because the music is difficult and not easily learned and requires preparation, choir practice, and 500 people can't sing them in unison without years of experience of this sort of thing. A 4-square hymn accompanied by the organ can be learned when the organist introduces it by playing the melody once, and then everyone is singing together. So there's a place for both. If you have a choir that has the time and the skill to sing Gregorian settings of the ordinary, great. And at St. Mary's, we sing the antiphons at the entrance, the offertory and communion before the people sing their hymns.
After all, St. Paul himself gave the instruction, I think it's to the Thessalonians, when he says, "Sing to yourself in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs."
Right.
And when I've quoted that verse to some Catholic traditionalists about in favor of hymns, they've sort of sniffed and said, "It's the Bible, you know."
Of course, what happened in the 19th and 20th centuries is that hymn singing did become a part of the Catholic liturgy at low Mass. While the priest is up there saying his Mass, the people would be singing hymns to give them something to do. And they were
Right.
often in the vernacular. This happened a lot in Germany, and then in France, and then in the United States. And it was often maudlin Victorian melodies of recent composition.
Mary recrowned me with flowers today, with blossoms today.
That's exactly, yeah. But the music is essential, because can you imagine at your child's birthday party saying, "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, dear Elias, happy birthday to you"?
Right.
No, you sing it, right? And in singing it, you change the entire experience. Speaking and singing are fundamentally different. Singing lifts the mind and the heart in a way that spoken words simply can't. This is why Plato knew that musicians were potentially the most dangerous people.
Right.
I've
sometimes contended that one of the reasons that so many Catholics stand like this during the hymns and keep their mouths firmly shut is because they have a deep sense deep down that if they do actually sing, they're going to become a little bit vulnerable and their heart might be open to God. And so they want to sort of block that out that vulnerability. Because when we sing, most of us are not really confident singers. And so when we sing, even just a little bit, we open ourselves up and become a little bit vulnerable. And that as you say, opens up the spirit and opens up the mind and combines it with the music and words combined in a way which nothing else can do.
I'd like to make another point, if I may, about music and text. Not all music is appropriate to the sacred liturgy. So much of what was marketed as liturgical music in the 1970s and 80s has more in common with the Broadway stage than it does with the sacred action of Christ in the Mass. So when I came to St. Mary's, one of the first tugs of war with some people was letting go of that mode of musicality that's theatrical and emotional and designed to elicit an emotional response. And I said, no, this is not appropriate to the liturgy. And to those who were accustomed to singing it, like On Eagle's Wings, which is deeply stirring to people who love that style of music, right? It sounded like I was rejecting the emotion that they experienced when they sang that music.
Right.
And my point was, no, not at all. I'm simply saying not every kind of music is suitable to the sacred liturgy. For example, the text Tantum Ergo, right? Every Catholic should be able to sing that in Latin. Now,
Sing what? Sing what?
Tantum Ergo.
Right.
But imagine if you sang it this way. Tantum ergo sacramentum venere mercenui ad antiquum documentum. You see how my point, the same words to music that's inappropriate to that context destroy the experience. The music and the words have to be a happy union to be sacred music. And the inspiration for truly sacred music is plain chant. It's breathed prayer, which is why Vatican II says Gregorian chant is the music most proper to the sacred liturgy. Polyphony is an extension of plain chant.
And I would contend that if our liturgy focused on this perfect blend of words and music and appropriate music, and if we were teaching it in our Catholic schools and our children experienced it in our church choirs, in our school choirs, then it would actually have a beneficial influence on the rest of the culture, because it would have to actually improve people's ear, improve people's discernment for music, and improve their understanding of music and words, which would flow over and enrich the whole culture.
When I got started here, the first Mass we learned to sing was the Missa de Angelis, and we sing it quite a bit. And about, I don't know, 9 months after we had begun singing it every Sunday, one of the fathers in the congregation found me after Mass to say that he discovered his 8-year-old son singing the Sanctus from the Missa de Angelis in the shower, because the boy had discovered the resonance of being in the tile shower.
Right, right.
But the point is, an 8-year-old boy had already learned by heart the words and music of the Sanctus in the Missa de Angelis.
And this is one of the things I find so encouraging at OLR as well, with our school and our children. Like St. Mary's, there's lots of young families there and lots of children involved in the liturgy and in the life together, that the kids get it. You know, when I actually share with our altar servers or with our children at school what the liturgy is about, why we took the trouble to build a beautiful church, why we have stained glass windows, what the baldacchino means, and what the architecture of the church symbolizes, they latch onto this. This is the language and the view of the world that children really understand and appreciate. They love symbolism. They love to see the deeper meaning in things. And if we must all become as little children, they are a great instruction for all of us, I think.
A Baptist man who came into full communion with the church here some years ago said the first time he came into the building of St. Mary's, he had his son, who was about 5 years old at the time. And as they came in the sacred gloom of the church, with the light filtering through the windows and the sight of the altar, the tabernacle, and the sanctuary lamp, the little boy said to his father, "Daddy, does God live here?" A question he had never asked in a whitewashed Protestant church.
Preaching hall.
Right.
Yeah.
The experience of the beautiful and sacred space opened the door in the boy's heart to the numinous presence of God.
You've probably had the same experience with at your RCIA classes of having converts from the Protestant churches come to Mass and come to a beautiful building and come to a beautiful liturgy and say things like, this is what I've always been looking for. I never knew I would find it in the Catholic Church, or this is the way church is supposed to be, or this is true worship. And they're saying it not out of a place of being well catechized and being well educated. They're really saying it from the heart and from the human instincts.
Well, it's what you call more Christianity. Right. Not C.S. Lewis's mere Christianity, but more Christianity. Yes, the truth of the gospel, the old story, plus so much more.
Right.
The incarnate experience of the truth of the Word of God in the sacraments, in sacred worship, in buildings that are embassies of the kingdom of heaven.
And I think this is what you and I as converts have both experienced, that coming from a Protestant evangelical background, we have committed the Catholic Church and said yes to more things, not neglected and rejected what was in the past, but added more to it and said, yes, I can remember, as we both lived in Europe as well for a time, going into the old churches, going into the old cathedrals, and just participating in that broader Catholic culture was converting. And therefore, this is why we're doing this course on taking root in Catholic culture, because Catholic culture should be influencing and changing. The Catholic faith should be influencing changing the culture around us, not the other way around. And I feel one of the big problems in the last 50 or 60, the revolution of the last 50 or 60 years, is that the Catholic Church has been changed by the culture rather than the Catholic Church changing the culture.
Yes. Think, for example, of Thomas Merton's account in the Seven-Storey Mountain of walking into a church where the Mass was being celebrated. The building was beautiful, noble. The ritual and music were transformative. And he knew in the instant of the experience that he was in the presence of the one he did not yet know. He couldn't go any further than that at the point, but immediately he was drawn, right? Tennessee Williams had the same experience in the Cathedral of Cologne, Germany. No one walks into an Am Church barn, which is built to be the most roof for the least buck, with ugly drab furniture and bumpy bronze that looks like it got blown off the Death Star, and refrigerator art made by the second grade festooning the walls of the church, the cheap drywall, sheetrock walls of the church. No one has that experience of the numinous presence of God in those settings. My experience of that was in the chapel of Princeton University, which is a masterpiece of neo-Gothic architecture, and in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, first Catholic church I was ever in. That encounter with the numinous presence of God can't happen in buildings that look like a Pizza Hut.
And it doesn't have to be a great cathedral, a great neo-Gothic building. My first experience of this was actually in the little stone Anglican church about half a mile from St. Mary's in Greenville. I was a student at Bob Jones University, and we were allowed to go to the Holy Trinity Anglican Orthodox Church, as it was called. And for the first time, we knelt down to pray, and out of musty prayer books with the 17th century language of the Anglican Church, lit candles and sang beautiful hymns. And even in that little church there in Greenville, which is quite a humble little church, but still a beautiful piece of church architecture, there was a connection with this greater, older, richer, and deeper tradition, which eventually, of course, led me to the Catholic faith. Well, this has been a great conversation, Father Newman. Thank you for joining us here this evening. Do you have anything else you'd like to add about the influence of liturgy in our culture today? What is the way forward for, would you say, to a young priest who's perhaps just coming out of seminary or looking forward to ordination and is likely to be headed for what you call an Am Church parish?
Nourish your soul wherever you can, Father, I would say. be enriched by beauty in prayer and in worship, beauty in architecture. Um, um, Young priests may have to travel to experience that. I think it's why so many um, um, look to the celebration of the extraordinary form. If a priest who chooses the extraordinary form solves a half a dozen problems with that one decision. No altar girls, no communion in the hand, no liturgy committees, no guitars, no tambourines, um, no horse blanket vestments. It's all gone, right? And what you have left is something noble and beautiful. Doing it in a normal parish setting for the ordinary form of the Roman Rite requires a greater effort, because you've got to contend with all of those dimensions of life that went so badly wrong 2 generations ago. But it's worth the fight.
I would say the same thing, to actually keep an eye on the ball, know where you're going, and that God plays a long game, and you've got some time to do all this, especially if you're a young man in your 20s or 30s.
Yeah, and if all else fails, come to Greenville, I would say. Visit, yeah, on a weekend, go to Our Lady of the Rosary and Prince of Peace and St. Mary's and experience the richness.
And in fact, this is something we're experiencing right now, as a lot of people are moving for political or economic reasons from blue states to red states. Um, we're also finding an influx. I'm sure you're experiencing this at St. Mary's, as we are at OLR, of people who are writing to us from around the country saying, is it possible to move to Greenville? We'd like to be part of the Catholic community there. And indeed, the extended Catholic community here is very invigorating. And I just think it's curiously ironic that all this is taking place in the town, in the hometown of Bob Jones University, in the center of the Bible Belt. So God's doing a wonderful work here, and thanks for being with us this evening. We're going to close now with prayer, unless there's any other questions. Someone said they were shocked to hear you sing the Tantum Ergo set to My Darling Clementine.
That was the point.
Yeah.
That was the point.
Almighty God, who has given us grace at this time with one accord to make our common supplications unto you, and has promised that when 2 or 3 are gathered together in your name, you are there in their midst. Fulfill now, O Lord, the desires and petitions of your servants, as be most expedient for them, granting us in this world knowledge of your truth, and in the world to come, life everlasting. Thank you again, Father Scott Newman, for being here with us. And folks, Katie and Caitlin, who are moderators for our course, have done a great job. We thank them. Thank all of you for being here. And they're talking about doing round 2, maybe in the fall. So stay tuned, and we'll have some other great guests talking about the interaction of faith and culture. If you have any ideas or suggestions, feel free to send us an email, and we'll try to weave those things in into our next round in the fall. Thank you again. Thank you, Father Newman.
Bye-bye.